Wolves hunt in packs. They attack their prey in groups. The lone wolf hunts alone, unrestrained by the limitations or cautiousness of an organization. I'm not talking about the animal. I'm talking about the terrorist. These are terrorists that don't belong to any organization. They just think up their plans to kill and maim innocent people, and they do it. Author Jeffrey Simon has written a book about lone wolf terrorists, who they are, what makes them tick, and what to do about it. The book is Lone Wolf Terrorism, and Jeffrey Simon joins me in the studio. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
How do you define a lone wolf terrorist as opposed to a lone wolf criminal?
I take a broad definition where I look at an individual working alone or could have some assistance by one other person, but they're not part of an organized group. And I don't believe they need to have a political, social, or religious objective. So I do at times see a criminal as rising to the threshold of a lone wolf. For example, if there is a criminal without a political, religious, or social objective who commits a mid-air plane bombing that causes fear throughout the society, questions about airport security, I still see that as a terrorist act. So it's a special category. But the key part is that the lone wolf terrorist is doing things that are causing certain effects on society as different from the common criminal act.
Even if he didn't mean for it to affect society as a whole.
Exactly. The criminal terrorist doesn't have those objectives.
So what makes a lone wolf terrorist more dangerous in some ways than the organization?
There's several reasons. One is, as you mentioned, they can think up anything they want, any scenario they want, and then act upon it because there's no group dynamics that will stifle their plans. A terrorist group has to go through decision-making processes. Even if it's just a cell, somebody may say, hey, that doesn't sound like a really great idea. The lone wolf would just say, this is something I want to do. I think I'll get away with it, and they do it. And that's one of the reasons throughout our history, some of the most creative and innovative attacks have been done by lone wolves. Lone wolves also are dangerous and different than organized groups because it's harder to find them before the attack. In a group, you can arrest somebody and learn about plans and operations. You can't do that with a lone wolf.
It's harder to keep things secret when there's more people involved.
Exactly.
But also the situation with their public and the public's reaction to their crime. They don't really care how their target audience really reacts to it.
Exactly. We always have to think terrorist groups have support bases. There are people in the community who may not like the violence, but they still support the cause, or they have certain constituencies that they're addressing. For the lone wolf, they're not concerned with alienating the public, alienating supporters, because they're operating by themselves. And they're also not concerned about a law enforcement crackdown or reaction after the event that may wipe out the group.
Because they may be suicidal anyway, so who cares?
Absolutely. And another factor is some lone wolves, not all, but some are mentally unstable, yet very creative and very smart, and they can be dangerous. And terrorist groups usually weed those types of individuals out.
So why should we care, Jeff, whether it's an attack is by a lone wolf or by an organization? What difference does it make?
Well, it makes a number of differences. With the organization, there's so many mechanisms in place. We've invested so much time and resources to combating terrorism via the organization. So there's a lot of things that law enforcement, intelligence know what to do when an attack is by a group. When it's an individual, it gets more tricky. Plus, the individual can give ideas to other individuals, the copycat effect, where when you have a lone wolf attack, just like we had in Boston, which I see as lone wolf, even though it's two brothers, we can look at them as two lone wolf brothers, give other ideas to other individuals, unfortunately, around the country, around the world, about perpetrating similar kind of attacks against soft targets, people at sporting events that aren't protected.
So what's the psychological makeup of a lone wolf terrorist?
There is no profile, and that's what's interesting. The lone wolf has cut across all kinds of ideologies. They've cut across all kinds of ages, races, ethnicity. The only difference, I would say, between the lone wolf and the person that is part of a group is that sometimes a lone wolf might have a personal grievance or something that's happened in their life, and then they may attach an ideology to it and say we're doing it in the name of this cause. But until we really have studies on all kinds of terrorists that are part of groups, we really don't know if that's also come into play when terrorist groups recruit individuals to be members of their group, that they too had some personal problem in the past, but now they're a member of Al-Qaeda or they're a member
We
of
usually see them as loners, but the Boston bombers weren't loners at all. They were very social.
Exactly. And one of the things I found in my research is that the internet is such an important factor now for the lone wolves. In other words, lone wolves are not as alone as they were before the internet. With the internet now, they can communicate with others. They can basically post their blogs, post Facebook pages, and they can become radicalized through these anonymous chat rooms. So in a way, they're loners in one sense, but they're like everybody else, addicted to the internet.
The book we're discussing is called Lone Wolf Terrorism, Understanding the Growing Threat. Jeffrey Simon is in the studio with me. He's an author. This is his second book. He's also president of Political Risk Assessment Company. Talk about how female lone wolf terrorists are different than their male counterparts. For one, there's not as many, obviously.
Well, that was a surprising finding. I thought, as I did the research for the book, that there would be many. And the reason is that females have been very prominent in terrorist groups throughout history. Females were very prominent during the anarchist wave in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Bottom Manhoef gang, which became the Red Army faction, they had as one of their leaders a woman. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka had women. The religious groups now are using women, even though at first there were some prohibitions against them. So women were very effective. So when I did this research, I thought even though the whole population of lone wolves isn't that large, we're going to find maybe an equal amount, men and women. It wasn't the case. And I didn't have an answer for that, because if women are active in groups, why not as an individual? So I began looking at the psychological and sociological literature describing differences between men and women. And one of the things that came out was that women value human interactions and social groups more so than men, and lone wolf is a lone activity. The other thing is that antisocial personality disorders and paranoid schizophrenia is less common in women than in men, and we found cases, more cases of that, in terms of the lone wolves. But we've had some remarkable recent cases of lone wolf women. One was Jihad Jane. Her name was Colleen LaRose. Now, she was an American blue-eyed blonde who just announced one day on the internet she wants to do something for, jihadists. She wants to martyr herself for the cause, and she had no connections at all. But through the internet, she tried to form a whole network, and she traveled to Europe to attempt to assassinate a illustrator who had angered Muslims throughout the world with derogatory caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. Then we had the case of Roshana Chaudhry.
Before you get to that, though, sticking with Jihad Jane a little bit, she was a convert to Islam. Is there a specific role or a reason that this type of activity would attract converts, especially?
In terms of the terrorism activity? Yes. I mean, in the sense that once they converted over, she may have felt now she needs to do something to prove herself. But I mean, this is still minority because so many converts do not engage then in violence. They just,
terrorism as a whole is a minority.
Right.
Otherwise, we'd have a big problem.
Exactly. And she could have even done this without converting. She could have just come into the process. But no, she did convert. And then either, through, she had a troubled life also. There were certain personal issues in her past. And some of those may come into play that this gave her now a purpose, something to do. And once she started connecting with others through the internet, she became even more radicalized.
And you say, of course, obviously the internet's been huge in promoting radicalization and giving people ideas and things, but it's also, on the other hand, easier to catch people because of the internet.
That's why I call it a double-edged sword. What's happening is that, the internet gives lone wolves ideas, it gives them tactics, targets, how to get weapons. But because lone wolves actually like to talk a lot through the internet, we're beginning to find out about them and catch them after the fact. The key is to try to find them before they act. Many lone wolves have posted manifestos right before they attacked. For example, in Norway, Anders Breivik, who massacred the kids on the island in Norway, he basically posted a manifesto right before his attack where he talked about violence is something you have to kill a lot more than just a few because that's how you get your message across. And other lone wolves have done the same, intercepting their emails, being able to monitor them, but also protecting civil liberties of law-abiding citizens. That's the catch.
Let's talk about lone wolves and WMD. Why would they be more likely to try to attain or use a weapon like that than a terrorist organization would?
Going back to the whole thing about no constraints on their violence and they can think up any scenario they want and then act upon it. Some groups would really think twice about using a WMD because, one, they may think it won't accomplish what we want to accomplish. It may really turn off our supporters, who are supporting our cause, but not always all the type of violence we're doing. And they may also be concerned, a group, in terms of the repercussions after they use a WMD, what's going to come down the pike in terms of law enforcement reaction and so forth. The individual terrorists wouldn't have those concerns. So if you get a smart, savvy individual who through the internet or through their own experience, as was the case with, I have in my book, Bruce Ivins, who sent the anthrax letters.
This was in 2001.
Yes. And everybody after those letters were sent thought, oh, this is Al-Qaeda. But it wasn't. And he was a foremost world authority on anthrax vaccines.
But how easy is it to get access to those chemical and biological agents?
Yeah. Well, the chemical agents and biological agents, you can get access to a number of them in terms of also homemade type of, like ricins made from castor beans and the seeds and all things like that. But, I mean, it's not as easy as getting explosives for a bomb. But we have to remember the sheer number of potential lone wolves is almost unlimited. Anybody in terms of trying to, from laboratories, university research places, mail orders, trying to be able to design these type of weapons. And we don't have to have a mass casualty attack. Just like the person sending the ricin letters to the Senator Wicker and then President Obama, that just shows this potential is out there for these individuals to get access to biological or chemical agents and then try to use them.
What about a nuclear weapon?
It's a little harder because, one, in terms of
I would hope it's a lot harder.
Yeah. Well, we have to think about what we're talking about. If we're talking about a large weapon, they're not going to be able to transport that. And the suitcase bomb, the suitcase nuke, still is a possibility, but nothing has really materialized yet in terms of that. But radiological material, putting in a dirty bomb, that's a possibility. But I put chemical and biological at the top of the list, and the nuclear way down.
The book is called Lone Wolf Terrorism, Understanding the Growing Threat. Author Jeffrey Simon is in the studio with me. Are lone wolves impossible to stop?
No, not at all. Just like all terrorism, we're never going to see an end to it. You can't have an end to terrorism when it could be one person with one cause and one bomb. But through a number of innovative strategies and policies, such as, and we're seeing some of that already, improved detection devices in post office and other places, that helps prevent lone wolves from succeeding in sending anthrax or other things through the mail. Expansion of CCTV, closed-circuit television cameras, is one of the potential benefits that we can see in terms of trying to catch lone wolves.
But we can catch them after the fact.
But before,
and
also,
that happened in the Boston Marathon
right.
bombings.
But let's fast forward and think, technology has improved. So CCTV cameras can see the brothers as they're approaching the finish line with their bags, and through different techniques know that carrying that bag, and this goes also into biometrics, gait analysis, how you're walking, it's not just running gear that's in the bag, but it's a bomb. And then the CCTV cameras can also see where somebody put something down and then moved away, an unattended package. But we have
You've
to
only got seconds, though.
But if we get that technology eventually that can real-time monitor and be able to, send that, blip to somebody who can then get it back to law enforcement. In the case of the Boston bombers, it was very quick, but sometimes you might have a minute or two before the bomb goes off. So.
But all this is going to cost a lot of money, and we don't have that kind of money right now.
It's an investment. I mean, it's a matter of we spend so much on the security and combating terrorism against the larger groups that we've kind of neglected trying to think what can we do for the individual terrorists. And obviously, it's a trade-off. We're not going to be protected all the time. But it might, as technology improves, the cost comes down. It might not be as expensive in terms of implementing some of these systems. And definitely the Internet, the key problem is how do you monitor the Internet to catch the bad guys and bad women without violating all of our rights to privacy and our own email accounts. But
how do you do that?
Nobody has the answer yet. But that's something that's going to have to be looked at because there's just too many indications that the overwhelming majority of the lone wolves have given indications before in terms of on the road to radicalization and that they're potential candidates to commit a terrorist attack.
You say that one of the early warning signs is that the lone wolf will break off from any organization or group, or sometimes an extremist group that he might be belonging to because they're not extreme enough. and that's a sign.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, Timothy McVeigh, who perpetrated the Oklahoma City bombing, and he had help from Terry Nichols in preparing the bomb, but I still look at him as basically a lone wolf, was turned away by the Michigan militia because they felt he was too unstable, too extreme. And in his case, he then decided he's going to show them, he's going to show everybody, and took revenge against the U.S. government for a raid on Waco, Texas. So, being able to monitor, if you can get wind of things along those lines, individuals who've approached
Also,
groups.
the Boston bomber, the older brother, he used to go to that mosque in Boston, I don't know which one, and he had extremist views, and people knew it. I wonder if those organizations have a responsibility to say something about that.
Yeah, and a number are, in terms of there are, moderates, in the communities who do not agree with these extremist beliefs and do inform the authorities, but the key is that if somebody's just saying something,
they're not breaking the law.
Exactly. We do live in a country of free speech.
So we have to wait for them to do it.
No, we have to just try to get smarter and try to see what's the difference between those who are just, extolling rhetoric and those who look like they're on the verge of actually following through.
Jeffrey Simon is in the studio with me. He's an author and president of Political Risk Assessment Company. His book is called Lone Wolf Terrorism, Understanding the Growing Threat. Is there a difference, Jeff, in how we counter the religious terrorist as opposed to the secular terrorist?
In terms of, not in terms of the technology of monitoring communications, but in terms of the message, definitely yes. In terms of for the religious terrorists, that's where you have to work with the moderate elements in any religious community to be able to show them that, the violence is going against the teachings of holy books and other, religious
In
things.
Islamic terrorism in particular, that doesn't seem to be working.
Well, we don't know yet because we are,
It's been over 10 years since 9/11.
But not all of the terrorist attacks in the homeland have been Islamic terrorists. We have to remember that. We've had a lot of white supremacist individuals as lone wolves attacking. We've had single-issue lone wolves attacking. So obviously, it hasn't been 100%, a policy that's worked, but there is an effort to be able to talk to the community leaders and be able to turn that around.
Some would say that it's not a place for governments to get involved in religious counter messaging. Do you agree with that? Do you think that we should just stay out of that?
Well, the government can't say to the communities, this is against the religion. That's where it has to be from the religious leaders in these communities. But I don't think anything's wrong with the government approaching different communities, intelligence, law enforcement, telling them, look, we need your help. Not dictating them what to do, but
What about monitoring mosques and religious pamphlets and things that are at those mosques?
But then you get into touchy ground because then you're.
But what do you think?
I don't think you should monitor what's going on inside a mosque. Just like you shouldn't monitor what goes inside a church, inside a synagogue. But in terms of who may be communicating with who that is known as a radical, again in any religion, and monitoring the literature, there's nothing I don't see wrong with that in terms of if there are signs that it's being exploitable, in terms of that there individuals are following that and then following through with an attack, such as like the Inspire magazine online of Al-Qaeda.
Describe that a little bit.
That's a magazine that they posted online, described how to make homemade bombs, the pressure cooker bombs, actually detailed information on any individual to put together a pressure cooker bomb, which the Boston brothers had learned. That's how they learned how to do it. And Inspire magazine originally, it was also associated with Anwar al-Awlaki, and then there were others who were involved with that. And I called al-Awlaki the godfather of lone wolf terrorists because he, in addition to just online material, he had online sermons. And even though he's dead now, you don't die on the internet. And those sermons are still being circulated. And the case of this British woman, Chandri, she had not been radicalized at all, no signs of anti-Western sentiment. She was going to graduate from King's College with honors, and she dropped out just a few weeks before graduation and then attempted to assassinate a British member of parliament who voted for the wars in Iraq. And when the police said, my God, we're not finding any radicalization prior to this, what made you do it? she secretly downloaded 100 sermons of Al-Awlaki from November into May of 2010. And then after she listened to the 100th sermon, she said, I have to act. So here we have radicalization without any email contact, without any face-to-face contact, just simply clicking on the computer and listening to the...
And she would have been impossible to catch beforehand.
She would have been possible.
Because we can't just say, oh my gosh, there's been 100 downloads of this very radical sermon. We need to go and talk to this woman or whatever.
Yeah, well...
Because that's civil liberties. You can download as much as you want.
Exactly. Now, if she'd been in communication with him, and there's emails going back and forth when he was alive between somebody and him, then that's a different level.
Which was the case with Major Hassan
exactly.
in the Fort Hood shooting.
Exactly. And that's another case where the internet played a key part and where the radicalization process is, tied in to this technology. The internet's a great thing, but it also has some negative aspects.
Do you think that in that case in particular in Fort Hood that there was a failing of the FBI and the Army in not catching that earlier?
There was a failure in terms of not seeing those erratic signs by Hassan. He had said a lot of things. He called his supervisor.
They did see it, but they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah, well, I don't know if they knew about that. He had said his supervisor was an infidel. She's going to burn in hell. But they did not do anything in terms of the email exchanges because he had convinced them he was doing that for research.
Jeffrey Simon is in the studio with me. He's the author of the book called Lone Wolf Terrorism, Understanding the Growing Threat. You have a previous book called The Terrorist Trap. What is that trap?
That trap was the overreaction to terrorism back in the 80s, the 90s, where every time there was a hostage crisis, it became a major crisis for the government in terms of policies that we would follow that weren't in the best interest of the country, such as the arms for hostages deal with Iran. And the terrorist trap basically is the psychological mechanisms that are at play where terrorists can exploit the fear element and they can exploit how governments and societies react to terrorism. And
do you think we're still overreacting to terrorism?
Not as much as before. I mean, basically, we've been hit pretty hard, in terms of with the 9/11 attacks. But there still can be overreaction because there's a lot of interest, self-interest from politicians, from government, from terrorism experts, from everybody in this terrorism industry. So there is overreaction at certain points, but there are some significant events that can occur that we have to deal with. But the major part of that terrorist trap when I wrote it was the fallacy of declaring a war on terrorism. And that didn't die out. We continued that with in the past decade. And even though current administration is not using that term, it's just a matter of time before something else is going to happen. Maybe another administration comes in and the term or a politician says it, we're back at war with terrorism.
But when, God forbid, that next event does happen, how are we supposed to react? Not only as the government, but as a people. It
has to be always measured responses. I mean, sometimes behind the scenes responses are sometimes better than, high profile public statements, unless there's something going to be accomplished in terms of, whether it be the press conferences or the presidential statements in terms of this is what we're going to do. I mean, you definitely have to react with, law enforcement's intelligence, trying to find out what occurred. And so definitely there's going to be, continued focus on after the fact, is there more that's going to be coming from that group or from that individual?
Going back to some of your strategies, you say that one is to counter the hero status of terrorists. I know that, Hamas in Gaza, which is an organization, does a lot to really promote the hero status of their suicide bombers. How do we, as a government, counter that?
Yeah, what we need to do is first definitely show in terms of what the effect of that suicide bombing has had on the victims and on the community, and that.
But these guys don't really care about that. I mean, they mean to kill and maim innocent people.
Right, but trying to get the support basis for all these suicide terrorists to kind of shift in terms of what the effect may be. It's in terms of the lone wolf. It's a different kind of element. What's happening because of social media, all lone wolves are getting Facebook pages put up. Eric Rudolph, who was the Olympic bomber in 1996
in Atlanta,
and then went on a spree of abortion clinic bombings. After he was captured, all kinds of Facebook pages in his support showed up. Same thing with the Boston brothers, the bombers in Boston. They got pages and support showed up. Because what happens is a lone wolf is going to touch a nerve in society because whatever issue they did their violence against,
somebody agrees with them.
Definitely. And so the way to counter that anti-hero status of them is to, one, sometimes acknowledge what those issues are. Don't totally discount it and say, this is crazy, this is nonsense, that, yes, we understand there are grievances to be addressed, but you address it through nonviolent means, and then showing the suffering that innocent people have, endured because of their acts. And it's not going to work with everyone, but there has to be some kind of strategy on that basis.
What does the future look like with respect to lone wolf terrorism?
I see it increasing. I see there are going to be more attacks, mainly because we're living in what we can call basically leaderless terrorists, that there are just terrorists out there that don't have to be part of an organization. They're getting radicalized more through the internet. A lot of the economic crises that we're facing, the global recession, can also cause some individuals to perpetrate a violent act because, they've lost their home, they've lost their savings. The remnants of the Iraqi and Afghanistan wars can lead to lone wolves, not just in the United States, but around the world, as remnants of different cells take their expertise to other countries.
So you think it's going to be the rule rather than the exception?
Oh, definitely. We're definitely going to still have the organized groups. We're going to have the cells, but we're going to see a continual, increase in these lone wolf attacks, including more attacks by women.
And also, Al-Qaeda has said publicly, don't wait for us. You guys, everybody out there can go and do a terrorist attack.
Exactly. The message now for people who wanted to go join Al-Qaeda is, well, you don't have to travel anywhere now to meet up with us. Here, we're telling you what to do. Go read the instructions on how to make these, weapons. And actually, one of the messages by one of the people from Al-Qaeda was, quote, "What are you waiting for? Go do it."
Jeffrey Simon, he's the author, and this is his second book. It's called Lone Wolf Terrorism, Understanding the Growing Threat. It's published by Prometheus Books. Jeff, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.